Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more coming your way. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I want to know how far this story has reached. No more waiting. Let's get into the video.
Space stretched like a frozen sea, silent and indifferent, pierced only by the cold blue beams of Magellan's Lament, a rusted cargo ship crawling through the outer Gacasian trade zone. Inside, the corridor lights flickered in rhythmic pulses, casting ghostly shadows across grime-covered bulkheads. The air reeked of recycled fuel, sweat baked into metal and ion-burnt plastic, a stagnant reminder that this vessel served commerce, not comfort. Captain Jareth Quinn walked with heavy steps, boots striking the grated floor with deliberate weight. A man of scars and silence, forged in the corporate wars of Venus orbit, he had seen every shade of cruelty the galaxy offered. But slave markets? They always made something twist in his gut. A synthesized voice echoed through the ship's hangar bay. Lot 79, female, origin, Kevlar system, species, unknown, mute, aggressive, behavior flagged as violent. Suggested use, mining labor or arena sport. Bidding starts at 50 plasma credits. Jareth stopped in front of the containment cell. Pale green plasma flickered in static arcs, forming a humming energy wall that held the subject inside. She crouched in the far corner, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her skin shimmered in a pearlescent grey, almost fluid under the glow. Eyes like molten amber stared, unblinking, but said nothing. Around her neck, a suppression collar blinking red with each pulse. She didn't even seem to breathe, but she was alive. Barely. Jareth frowned. The auctioneer drone hovered over, its spherical chassis polished to a sterile gleam, voice clipped and void of empathy. Interested in Lot 79, Captain? We can offer a 10% discount due to psychological degradation. Jareth's eyes never left the girl. No name, no species, just a number. If she doesn't speak, all translation protocols failed. Her language appears structurally incompatible with known families. Displayed hostility in all testing environments. Bit 2 handlers. High resistance to sedation. We recommend containment. Jareth said nothing at first. Then, I'll take her. The drone paused mid-hover, its lenses blinking with brief confusion. Confirmed acquisition. Buyer assumes full liability. Confirmed, he repeated, then added, eyes narrowing. Remove the collar. Now. Captain, that is highly ill-advised. Do it. There was a click, a metallic thud. The collar detached and dropped to the floor like a dead thing. The containment field fizzled out. For a heartbeat, the entire hangar seemed to freeze. She rose slowly, as if unused to standing. Her pupils dilated, muscles tensed, but she did not flee. Did not strike. She simply looked at him. Jareth stepped closer. You're free. Do you understand that? Still, she said nothing, but a single tear, thick and luminous like liquid crystal, slid down her cheek. He extended a hand. She flinched, so he pulled it back. We're leaving. You don't belong here. She hesitated, then stepped out of the cage. No sound, no words, only motion. She followed him. Behind her, the cell sat empty, like a forgotten crime. Around them, the auction continued, voices bidding, drones recording. No one noticed that a miracle had just walked away on 2 silent feet. In a sector where freedom was traded like fuel and lives were measured in credits, one man had done something unthinkable. He didn't buy a slave to own her. He bought her to set her free, and in doing so, he had just set something else in motion, something far bigger than either of them could yet imagine. The trade hub of Gacisia Prime orbited a dying red star, a scarlet eye bleeding into space. Surrounding it, hundreds of ships, freighters, slavers, pirates, and royal emissaries alike. It was a floating contradiction of diplomacy and depravity, known as the place where anything could be bought, including redemption. Jareth's ship, Magellan's Lament, docked with a hiss and magnetic clamp. Inside, the alien girl sat curled in a corner of the crew quarters, silent, still, and tense as a coiled wire. The room was dim, lit only by the soft pulse of navigation lights and the dull red hue from the window. The air smelled of ozone, metal, and recycled life support. She hadn't spoken, hadn't eaten, just watched him. He slid a tray onto the floor, hydration gel, nutrient bar, and warm cloth. "It's not much," he muttered. "But it's not poison either." No response. He crouched in front of her, careful to give space, studying her face, those golden eyes shimmering like plasma through mist. He'd seen fear, he'd seen rage, but she had neither, only withdrawal, not submission, not defeat, just absence. "They called you hostile," he said softly. "But you're not, are you? You're wounded, misunderstood." The only movement was a blink, slow, calculated. He sighed and leaned back against the wall, letting silence fill the room like pressure in a vacuum. The auction had been worse than usual. Alien merchants paraded beings like livestock, humans, Glarians, Varth, even a few cybernetic hybrids. Some cried, some screamed, others just stared into nothing. The worst part, the buyers clapped, laughed, bargained, but she hadn't made a sound. She had stood in her cage like a statue, mute, unreadable. And yet, her presence had cut through the noise like a blade. Now, in the half-light of his ship, that presence remained. Something ancient lived behind those eyes. Not savage, so much more than that. Composed. Watching. Jareth tilted his head. "You understand me, don't you?" A long pause. Then, slowly, she reached for the nutrient bar, fingers long, elegant, trembling slightly. She took it, ate in silence. Jareth almost smiled. "Good. That's good." A flicker, barely noticeable, but her head inclined ever so slightly. A nod or instinct? Didn't matter. It was a start. He stood and walked to the control console. Outside, Gakisia loomed, its glowing rings of junk and commerce slowly spinning. Somewhere down there, others had seen her only as property. He saw something else, a mystery, a survivor, a signal waiting to be decoded. She didn't know it yet. But he had no intention of selling her, trading her, or treating her as anything less than a person, even if the rest of the galaxy disagreed, even if she never spoke a word. The corridors of Magellan's Lament groaned with age as the ship cruised slowly away from Gakisia Prime, its engines humming with uneven rhythm like a tired beast limping through the stars. Inside, Captain Jareth Quinn watched the stars drift from the viewport, arms crossed, jaw tight. She hadn't spoken, but she hadn't attacked either. That in itself felt like a fragile miracle. She was still in the quarters, still silent, still watching him, always watching. Her eyes didn't flinch, didn't flicker. They just followed every movement he made, like she was calculating something he'd never understand. Not fear, not hate, just waiting. Waiting for what? He didn't know, but he wasn't letting her rot in that cell. Jareth walked back to the crew quarters with a datapad in one hand and a thermal blanket in the other. She hadn't moved from her corner, her knees drawn to her chest, eyes locked on the doorway the moment it hissed open. He paused, placed the blanket down, along with the pad. "It's cold out here in the belt. Thought you could use it." She didn't move, just blinked. Jareth tapped the datapad. It lit up, displaying basic pictograms and a translation interface. Dozens of alien dialects scrolled across the screen. "This might help us talk," he said quietly. "Just press anything that looks familiar." Still nothing, but her eyes moved to the pad. That was enough. He left her again, not because he gave up, but because pressure broke trust, and trust was what he needed now more than anything. Down in the engine bay, Jareth scrubbed oil off his fingers and stared at a half-broken coolant valve. The ship needed repairs. The hull integrity was dipping. He needed credits. He needed supplies, but he didn't care. He'd bought her to set her free, and even if she never said thank you, even if she never looked him in the eye again, he'd still done the right thing. She wasn't a weapon, she wasn't a threat, she was a prisoner, not just of Gakisia, but of everyone who had given up on understanding her. Hours passed. Then the chime. Crew quarters. Alert. Manual input detected. Jareth bolted up the ladder, nearly slipping on the rails. He entered the room. She was standing now, barely illuminated by the glow of the datapad. On the screen, one word, jagged, uneven, but unmistakable. Why? Jareth's breath caught in his throat. Not who are you, not where am I, not what do you want, just why? He swallowed. Because you looked like no one ever asked if you wanted to be saved. Her fingers trembled. The datapad glowed again. Still slave. He stepped closer, careful. No, he said softly. You're not anymore. Not to me. Not to anyone. Another blink. Longer this time. A breath. Then, for the first time, her lips parted. Not in speech, but in the faintest attempt at sound, a whisper, dry, broken, but real. Jareth. His name, from her voice, not perfect, not fluent, but him. Only him. And in that moment, a prisoner became something else, something sacred. The name lingered in the air like a ghost. Jareth, her voice, rasped, dry, almost unintelligible, still echoed in the back of Jareth Quinn's mind as he paced the bridge in slow, deliberate strides. He had heard it, clear enough to pierce through the hum of the ship and the weight of every unspoken moment between them. She'd said his name, not screamed it, not begged, just spoken it. And that changed everything. He hadn't asked for connection. He hadn't expected trust. He'd expected silence, or maybe hostility, but she had given him her first word. And now his thoughts spiraled through questions that had no answers. Who was she, really? What had they done to her before she ended up in that auction? What else had been taken from her, and what could still be given back? Down in the crew quarters, she sat cross-legged on the padded floor, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders like armor made of warmth. The datapad rested in her lap, pulsing softly. She wasn't tapping it anymore, just staring. Her name, his name, looped inside her head like a sound she'd never dared speak. Jareth, Jareth. The mouth movement was strange, not native to her biology. Her species, whatever it was, had different vocal cords, a different language entirely. One based more on internal harmonics, not vocal projection. That's why no translator worked. They hadn't listened. They'd just assumed she was mute, broken, so they collared her, caged her, sold her, but not him. This human didn't demand words. He waited, listened to silence like it was a language of its own. She picked up the datapad again and slowly, carefully, typed 2 more words. Name, mine. Jareth saw the message on the alert feed. He exhaled, sat down beside her, leaving just enough space to show he wouldn't push. He read it, smiled. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I'd like to know. She tilted her head slightly. Confusion, no, deliberation. Then she reached over and typed again, this time more confidently. Ienla. He repeated it aloud. Ienla, he said, savoring the syllables. That's beautiful. Her eyes didn't change, but something in her posture did, less rigid, less braced for pain, more present. Like she had stepped 1 foot out of the prison, still lodged, deep in her soul. Ienla. She had a name again. Not a number, not a label, a name. That night, Jareth watched her sleep in the quiet of the engine room where she had wandered, lulled by the rhythmic pulsing of the core. He didn't intrude, just stood by the door, arms crossed, silent. He thought about what she must have gone through. A life lived behind electric bars. Treated as dangerous because no one could hear her cry, but she had cried. Oh, she had, just not in a way anyone understood, and now, with only one word, his name, she had screamed everything the galaxy had ignored. Pain, loneliness, hope. It echoed louder than any scream could, and it made him swear to himself, right then and there, he would never let her be caged again. Gakisia's orbit was far behind them now, reduced to a thin glint of rust in the void. The Magellan's Lament glided through the outer drift, a stretch of space where no patrols dared and only the desperate roamed. Jareth liked it that way. No questions, no governments, no witnesses, only the stars, the hum of the ship, and the soft, barely audible footsteps behind him. Ienla had begun to move more freely, no longer confined to the crew quarters. She now explored the ship in cautious silence, her bare feet making no sound against the steel floor. She never touched anything without permission. She watched, she studied, she learned, but most of all, she listened. To him, to the way his voice changed when he cursed the engine, to the way he spoke to the ship like it was a person, to the way he said her name, without fear, without hesitation. Ienla, he said it like it meant something, like she meant something. In the mess bay, Jareth was assembling a barely functional meal, synth protein, freeze-dried beans, and a warmed ration bar. It wasn't fine dining, but it was edible, most of the time. She entered, not a sound. He looked up and gave a nod. Hungry? A small pause, then a single nod in return. He handed her the plate. She accepted it, sat across from him at the metal table. For a while, they ate in silence. Then she set the fork down, carefully. Typed into the pad again. Why help me? Jareth exhaled through his nose. That question again, but it wasn't irritation that followed. It was something deeper. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Because I've seen what the galaxy does to people it doesn't understand. It turns them into property, into ghosts, into monsters. He looked her straight in the eye. But I don't think you're any of those things. Ienla's fingers hovered above the pad. She trembled slightly. Then she typed, "You're not like others." Jareth gave a half-smile. "You're damn right I'm not." She tilted her head, then slowly, very slowly, placed a hand on the table between them. It was tentative, open, not reaching, not grasping, just there. An offering. Jareth didn't take it, he didn't rush. But after a heartbeat, he placed his hand beside hers, not touching, just near, close enough for her to know he saw her. Close enough for her to know she wasn't alone anymore. Later that night, Jareth sat in the cockpit watching the starfield. His fingers traced an old scar on his forearm, earned in a mining riot years ago. He thought of Ienla, the weight of her silence, the depth of her pain, and the fact that she had reached out, even if only a little, even if only once. It was more than most gave, more than most ever dared. In the shadows of her makeshift quarters, Ienla sat awake, blanket wrapped around her like a second skin. The datapad rested beside her. On the screen, in her own language, scrawled carefully by hand, "His voice feels like a place I used to know. Not a cage, not a wound. Maybe something like home." She closed her eyes and finally slept. Not in fear, not in tension, but in fragile, flickering peace. The Magellan's Lament drifted near the edge of the Dharam Fault, a dark rift in space where stellar charts stuttered, sensors blinked, and even gravity forgot itself. Most traders avoided it. Jareth didn't care. He wasn't running from danger. He was giving her space to breathe. Inside the engineering bay, dim amber lights blinked over consoles patched together with wires, memory foam, and old war tape. It was a mess, but it worked. Ienla sat on the grated floor, knees up, datapad in hand, watching him closely as he calibrated the ship's language processor. Her head tilted slightly with every beep, every change of pitch. Not confusion, calculation. He knew that look. She was learning fast. "This system's old," Jareth muttered as he pried open a panel. "Military surplus, pre-Confederation. But if I reroute the polyglot buffer through the AI's old acoustic map, maybe—" He looked at her, a grin forming. "Maybe we can talk for real." She didn't smile, but her eyes locked on his. That meant yes now. The work was tedious. Code lines flickered across a cracked screen. Jareth's fingers danced across the panel. The processor stuttered, coughed, then roared to life. A synthetic voice chimed, "Neural language bridge online." Awaiting dialect calibration. Ienla stared at the interface. It displayed a series of pulses, humming tones mapped to frequency matrices. Not words, not symbols, resonance. That was her language. He stepped aside. "Go ahead." She hesitated, then placed both hands on the console. Slowly, she let out a sound, not speech, not a word, but a resonant frequency, low and melodic, vibrating through the metal floor. The AI reacted instantly. Tone registered. Primary base frequency aligned, language passing 7%, 14%, 28%. It climbed higher, her fingers pressed down again. This time, the resonance deepened, rich, layered harmonics that seemed to bend the air around them, passing 71%, 90%, translation matrix stabilized. The AI's voice crackled. Communication bridge formed. Then silence. Jareth turned to her. "Can you hear me through this?" A pause. Then the AI responded, not in its own voice, but through hers. "Yes, I can." Jareth's breath caught. The voice was filtered, metallic, but unmistakably her thoughts, her intent, being shaped into his language. He stepped closer. "Ienla." She blinked, the glow of the console reflecting in her amber eyes. "I did not trust you at first," came the voice through the system, shaped by her thoughts. "You were loud and warm and strange." A flicker of something crossed her face. Not pain, something more delicate. "Vulnerability, but you are not like them. You give silence time to speak." Jareth swallowed hard. He reached out, slow and careful, placing his hand gently on the console beside hers. "That's all I ever wanted." Later that night, the ship floated on, silent and drifting. In her private log, Ienla used the processor to compose her first full sentence in human tongue. "He listens between my words. And in that space, I begin to exist again." The stars outside the Magellan's Lament blurred like streaks of memory as the ship passed through a low-gravity corridor. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a warm, amber hue. Quiet filled the vessel. Not the silence of absence, but the kind filled with breath, presence, meaning. Ienla stood before the ship's central AI console, her long fingers hovering above the now familiar interface. She had mastered the resonance bridge in days, what took linguists years. She bent into shape through raw instinct and impossible memory. She wasn't just speaking now, she was translating herself. Each sound, every layered frequency, wasn't just communication, it was emotion, pain, wonder, confusion, the ache of exile. And through the bridge, Jareth could finally hear it all, not perfectly, but enough. She turned to him, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The console activated. "I do not know what I was before this ship." Jareth sat across from her, hands clasped between his knees. I remember cold, metal, hunger, names I did not choose, hands that took, eyes that measured. She closed her eyes. You were the first not to measure. He didn't speak, just listened. That was what mattered now. In my world, we sang our names. She let a soft tone rise from her throat, pure, harmonic, trembling. It echoed faintly through the bulkheads. This is mine. Jareth swallowed. It wasn't a word, not really, not in human terms, but in that note, rising, falling, shaped by impossible intervals, he heard her. The way she remembered her family, the way she mourned them, the way she had carried her name like a buried star. And now she had sung it for him. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. A pause. Then the bridge translated her response. Now you know me. Later, in the observation bay, the two of them sat in silence, wrapped in the glow of a distant nebula. Colors danced across the black, gold, crimson, ocean blue. She pressed her palm to the glass, watching the particles swirl. Jareth leaned beside her. What is your home called? The console pulsed, but this time she didn't use it. Instead, she pointed to her chest, then pressed a hand gently against his, then lifted both hands and pointed to the stars. No word, no phrase, just a gesture that told a story. Where I come from is not a place anymore, it's a memory, and now you are part of it. Jareth's breath caught in his chest. He looked at her, not as a rescued stranger anymore, not as a mystery to decode, but as a being whose voice was finally beginning to return, one resonance at a time. And now he understood, not everything, but enough. Warning lights flashed dimly across the cockpit of Magellan's Lament. Jareth stood frozen at the console, jaw clenched. Behind him, Ienla watched in silence as the ship's proximity sensors painted 3 red signals on the screen, each one unmistakable. Slaver tags, Gaquisian bounty rigs. They had found her. 3 ships, Jareth muttered, voice tight. All Gaquisian make. Modified for pursuit. No doubt about it, they're coming for you. Ienla didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward and tapped into the neural bridge. Her voice filtered through the AI. They will not ask. They will not talk. They will take. Jareth nodded grimly. Neither. Then we won't let them. They descended quickly to the lower decks, Jareth moving with practiced urgency. He tossed open a storage locker and pulled out 2 weapons, an aging plasma carbine and a compressed arc shield. Ienla tilted her head at the gear, then looked to him. I am not weapon, she said through the translator, her tone low, conflicted. I know, Jareth said. I'm not asking you to be one. He handed her a compact beacon. But if something happens to me, hit this. It triggers the ship's memory core and sets the Lament to jump autonomously. It'll take you as far from Gaquisian territory as it can. She stared at the device in her hand. Small, harmless. But to her, it felt heavier than the chains that once held her. You would die for me. Jareth didn't blink. I bought you to set you free. That doesn't stop now. The first strike came without warning. The Lament shook as its portside wing took a kinetic round. Sparks burst from the overhead vents. One of the outer thrusters flickered and died. Jareth swore and bolted for the helm. They're boarding. One of them locked a grappler. He turned to Ienla. Hide. Last maintenance shaft on deck 3. Go. But she didn't move. I will not be caged again. The words weren't defiant. They were final. When the airlock blew, smoke rushed into the cargo bay. 4 armored slavers stormed in, rifles raised, visors down, voices distorted through synthetics. Return the property, one of them snarled. No one needs to die. Jareth stepped forward. You already made that choice when you put a collar on her. The slaver cocked his weapon, but then the air shifted. A sound pulsed from behind Jareth, not speech, resonance. A deep, shattering tone filled the cargo bay, low at first, then rising like a tidal force. Lights flickered, metal panels vibrated. The air thickened as Ienla stepped into view, her mouth open, her throat glowing faintly with that same golden light Jareth had seen in her eyes. The slavers staggered, disoriented. One dropped his weapon. Jareth raised his carbine, but didn't fire. He didn't need to, because they were already falling. Not from weapons, from her, from the force of a voice denied too long. A voice made of grief, fury, and something worse. Memory, one by one, the slavers crumpled to the floor, clutching their helmets, unable to process the sound. She hadn't attacked them. She'd reminded them of what they had done, of every scream they refused to hear, and now those echoes broke them. When it was over, Jareth looked at her, hands trembling, skin glowing faintly with residual light. She stood amidst the unconscious bodies like a ghost unchained. He stepped forward. "Ienla!" She looked at him, and for the first time, without the AI's help, her voice reached him directly. "I am not property." It was imperfect, strained, barely shaped by the limitations of her throat. But it was hers, and it was enough. The slaver ships burned behind them, 3 distant embers fading into the dark. Magellan's Lament was limping, but alive. The hull was scorched. The engines coughed plasma. The navigation system flickered in protest, but they had won, and Ienla had spoken. Now, silence reigned again, but it was no longer empty. It was alive with meaning, heavy with what had just been broken, and what had just been born. Jareth leaned against the control panel in the cockpit, a patch of blood soaking through his shirt. Nothing fatal, just a graze, but enough to remind him that what they were doing now was no longer survival. It was war, not of weapons, of witnessing, of saying, "We are not property." Behind him, Ienla stood at the viewport, arms crossed. Her reflection was a shimmer in the glass, tired but unbroken. She had changed since Gakisia, not physically, not even in posture, but in presence. She didn't drift through the ship like a shadow anymore. She walked, her gaze held steady. Her silence now felt like choice, not chain. And her voice, still uncertain, still difficult, had power behind it. Not just from the resonance, but from truth. Jareth turned to her. "They'll come again, not just slavers, the ones behind them. Whoever profits from silence." She nodded. "They always do." The words were processed through the translator, but she had spoken them herself, slow, broken, but growing stronger. He stepped closer. "We don't have to run anymore. I've sent out a signal. Encrypted, scattered through old Confederation channels. A message to anyone listening." He pulled up the console, tapped a sequence. On the screen, a looping transmission, text and voice overlay. "To any freeborn, refugee, rebel, or broken soul who remembers what it is to choose your own name, you are not alone. We are no longer silent. We are not owned." Ienla stared at the message, something flickering in her eyes. "You sent this for me?" "No," Jareth said. "I sent it because of you. Because others like you are still out there, still trapped in cages no one sees." She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "Then we find them." Jareth smiled. "Yeah, we do." In the following hours, Magellan's Lament moved slowly along the fringe, avoiding patrols, scanning old networks, ghost frequencies, unused supply codes, exile broadcasts, and then a ping, weak, broken, embedded in static. "Help! Us, slaves, rebelled, no weapons, being hunted, Gakisian outpost, Sector 6. The signal cut out. Jareth and Ienla locked eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her fingers were already setting coordinates. As the ship jumped toward the coordinates, Ienla stood once more at the viewport. She sang, not a song of sorrow this time, but one of gathering. A low, pulsing resonance filled the cabin, vibrating through the ship's bones. Jareth stood behind her, listening, not understanding the language, but feeling its promise, not a call for help, a declaration: we are no longer waiting. We are coming. We are ourselves. The Gakisian outpost was a graveyard of metal and fear. Jareth stood on the edge of a blasted landing platform, windless air thick with the scent of plasma ash and rusted blood. The facility below, half buried in a canyon scar, had been abandoned for cycles. But now it stirred with signs of desperation. Inside were 22 beings, refugees, escaped slaves, afraid, unarmed, hunted, and above them, circling like carrion hawks, came the ships, newer, faster, better armed than the ones that had chased Magellan's Lament. This time, the bounty wasn't just for Ienla, it was for the idea she now represented. Jareth turned to her, standing still at the loading ramp, eyes glowing faintly, hands folded over her heart. The resonance in her chest was low and steady, focused. "They'll land in minutes," he said. "We can't take them all. We don't have to," she answered, her voice barely shaped but steady. "They need to hear." Jareth frowned. "Ienla, if you do this, it'll mark you, not just as target, as leader." She looked him in the eyes. "I was already marked." She stepped past him, walked down into the canyon alone. The slaver units deployed in formation, rows of armored mercenaries in reinforced exosuits, Gakisian standard doctrine: intimidate first, kill second. The prisoners in the outpost huddled together, eyes wide, no weapons, no hope. Then, across the dust-choked canyon, a single figure stepped forward, Ienla, unarmed, uncovered, and singing. A resonance rolled across the sand, deep, pulsing, alive. It wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying, not in tone, but in truth. The soldiers paused, weapons trembling in hands, their comms shorted. The ground beneath them vibrated with something ancient, something unapologetic. And then the others began to rise, one by one. The refugees in the outpost stood and echoed. Their voices, fragile, different, fractured by years of pain, rose into a broken harmony. But in that brokenness came defiance, came strength. Came the song that said, "We remember who we are." The resonance grew. Systems collapsed. Shields blinked out, drones fell from the sky, the mercenaries turned to flee, overwhelmed not by force, but by something far more dangerous. Recognition. They weren't facing weapons, they were facing people, and people who remember their names do not kneel again. Hours later, when the fires dimmed and the ships were long gone, the refugees gathered in the canyon under the stars. Some still trembled, some wept, some laughed like children for the first time in decades. And in the center stood Ienla, not on a pedestal, not giving orders, just standing. Among them, with them, Jareth approached. She turned to him, face lit by the pale light of a broken moon. "You saved them," he said quietly. She shook her head. "We saved them." He smiled. Then, hesitantly, "What do I call you now?" She looked out across the gathered souls, so many stories, so much pain, and then back at him. "Call me free."